Welcome to the SDG Learncast with me, Pauline Duman. In every episode, I bring insightful conversations around the subject of sustainable development and learning, helping us all to achieve a sustainable future. As the world faces unparalleled challenges, including climate change, extreme inequality, and geopolitical shifts, the outdated financial system is struggling to meet these challenges. In this episode, we will explore the critical theme of long-term financing for sustainable development and the pressing need for reform in the global financial architecture. Our guest for this episode is Mr. Guillaume Lafortune, the Vice President of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN. Welcome to the SDG Learncast, Guillaume.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you, Pauline.
Thank you so much, Guillaume. Let's go straight to the topic on financing the SDGs. So, in the report you published last year, you highlighted that the progress of the SDG has been slowing. How is the outdated financing system contributing to these challenges?
There's two reports that are important here. There is indeed this paper that we published. I was a co-author to this. The lead author was our president, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, on the sidelines of an important summit, which was hosted in Paris last June. The paper is called The Case for Long-Term Financing for the SDGs. Before diving into this, it's important to look at another SDSN report, the Sustainable Development Report, which tracks the progress that the global community is making towards achieving the goals. We also released our latest edition last June, and the bottom line is that we're not on track to achieving those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. If we take the report of the UN, they say there's 15% only of the targets that it could assess that are on track to be achieved. We have a different methodology than the UN report. We arrived to the same conclusion, but our report was insisting on one thing, which is that by 2030, the gap in sustainable development, if we extrapolate the trends in the future, the gap between the poorest countries in the world and the richest country in the world in sustainable development might be larger than it was when we started this agenda in 2015, which, of course, Pauline, as you would imagine, this was not the objective initially. Of course, COVID-19, conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, and other parts of the world had a very negative impact on the SDGs, but we were also not on track anyways before those multiple and simultaneous crises hit. And so at the SDSN, we try to be quite vocal these days on what might be the solutions and ways to double down efforts to reverse this trend. I was just hearing someone talking about those SDGs becoming the slowly dying goals, which would be a pity because they remain the future we want. And so the way we're looking at it at SDSN is there's probably 5 things that are crucial to make progress on the SDGs. First is for countries to prepare long-term planning and pathways to achieve the goal. Second, it's to finance those pathways and those plans. Third is to promote global cooperation and partnerships for those goals. Fourth is for support to innovation for environmental sustainability, but also social inclusion. Fifth would be regular reporting and monitoring of the progress and performance. Let me underline the importance of the financing issue. Essentially, in the developing world, this is the major barrier for making any progress on this agenda.
One of the things that I highlighted on the report that you published last year, this really caught my eye, is that sustainable development is high return activity and government should leverage borrowing to finance infrastructure and human capital investments because the resulting economic growth will compensate the borrowing costs over time. Investing in energy and water can really provide high return activities. We need to convince governments across countries, across the world, that this is important. It is significant investment, but it is not impossible.
Yeah, absolutely, Pauline. And this is a very important point, which is that what the SDGs are is a long-term investment plan into essentially 2 things. It's physical infrastructure, renewable energy, digital technologies, and human capital, health, education, social protection. Those are investments that take years in order to materialize. The actual physical infrastructure can take 4, 5, even more in order to build the actual infrastructure. The returns on things like education is something that can take 10, 15, or 20 years. From the moment you have a child that manages to do all compulsory education and possibly even tertiary education that gets skills, and then that can actually innovate, bring value to the economy. These are things that are long-term investments, but that eventually will actually lead to economic returns. And that's something I think one of the issues with the way we currently assess risks or potential returns, including, for instance, in the credit risk rating system, which is very often very much focused on the short-term risks, but less on the long-term growth potential for investing into the SDGs, which in principle, if done correctly, will increase the growth potential and therefore the capacity of a country to reimburse the principal and the interest on loans, which could result in lower borrowing costs. So how do we move from focusing on the short risks to focus on more long-term potential? From a UNDESA report in 2022 that says financial markets overemphasize short-term economic returns and underweight longer-term issues, including environmental and social risks, as well as investments in resilience and sustainability. So it's this long-term perspective that we need to bring also to the financial market.
That sounds very logical to me and sounds very clear. Anyone who would hear that we should invest in physical infrastructure and human capital, no one would go against investment in health and education. But I think the problem is really the global financial architecture. There are financing difficulties, and these are affecting the developing countries' efforts towards achieving sustainable development. Maybe you can give an example of these systemic financial difficulties that impact developing countries and shed some light on this topic.
Maybe first we can just say a bit about what do we mean by this global financial architecture. This is the complex system of public and private finance that channels the world's savings to the world investments. So the global financial architecture, or the GFA, it includes multilateral institutions, for instance, the IMF and the World Bank, which of course can play a major role here, but also national and local budgets, public borrowing, including tapping into capital markets, but also private equity and debt financing. So it's a very complex system, essentially of both public and private finance that can be channeled to achieve the sustainable development goals. There's a financing gap, and this is about 4 trillion. I think it's interesting to note that the UN Secretary General last year called for an SDG stimulus in order to get closer to reducing this financing gap to achieve the SDGs. And one interesting point that the UN Secretary General is making is to call for an increase of the role of the multilateral development banks. And by multilateral development banks, we're talking about the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the EBRD, the Islamic Development Bank. Those are institutions that can borrow at lower rates compared with their national countries because the loans are guaranteed by a larger range of countries that are also equipped internally to investments, or at least are working towards getting equipped to align the investments to the SDGs, but also to manage sometimes regional types of investments. Because in the case of the SDGs, it's not only national investments, but regional investments in terms of energy and other types. So multilateral development banks are very important. The UN Secretary General called for an SDG stimulus of about an additional 500 billion per year. If we look right now at the main disbursements in 2021 of the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, EBRD, and the Islamic Development Bank, we are at about 100 billion per year. So there's a 4 trillion overall gap on the SDGs. We have this SDG stimulus to mobilize at least an extra 500 billion. The multilateral development banks are operating at about 100 billion a year. A final note on this. This paper was issued just before the summit in Paris on financing a global pact for people and climate. And what made the headlines after the summit was that there was this commitment to increase the lending capacities of multilateral development banks of 200 billion over 10 years. So people look at this, feel it's a large number. Now, you always need to annualize those numbers. And if you annualize this number after Paris, this is 20 billion. The SDG stimulus was calling for 500 billion. The SDG gap is 4 trillion. So the order of magnitude here is not there.
You highlighted not just the policy signal, but also the leadership. You also mentioned the important role of the multilateral development banks in addressing the financial challenges. I'm from a developing country. I'm from the Philippines. So it's more of the LMIC, the lower middle income country. And in fact, what I see in the multilateral development banks as the lender of last resort for developing countries. But I think the problem is that they have limited financial firepower and usually intervene when it's already at an emergency level. There is a problem with the role to perform the lender of last resort. Maybe if you can unpack a bit more, what is the important role of the multilateral development bank in addressing the financial challenges for the SDGs for the developing countries?
There's at least three good reasons why the rich world should care about strengthening the global financial architecture. One is pure solidarity. And for me, that's already something that would be enough. But it's not only solidarity. Second is if we let things go, CO2 emissions do not get addressed, global warming gets worse, there's continues to be deforestation, social unrest. Eventually, the rich world will be impacted. I mean, we can already see it with the increase of wildfires, but also the impact of population displacement. So it's not as if what's going on in the rest of the world is isolated from rich world. And third point, which we already discussed previously, is that I believe there's long-term economic returns actually huge from investing into long-term development. So I think it's profitable actually in the long run for many actors. I think there's a group of countries, just because you mentioned the Philippines, there's many countries that are also impacted in particular by extreme events and the actual impact from climate change. This whole discussions around how to deal with the rising costs of adaptation, but also loss and damage is a very important one, especially for this group of countries which are called the small island developing states. And so I think there was some progress that was done at the last few COPs around creating a fund for loss and damage in particular. Now, again, to the numbers, right now it's around 4 million USD that are available in this loss and damage fund announced at the COP in Dubai last year. And this is just a fund that was just announced. So hopefully countries will continue to chip in. But this is barely enough to actually just finance the secretariat that will actually coordinate this fund. Here also, it's a question of magnitude. And this issue is it's an issue of justice as well. Many of those countries have no responsibility for the climate change. They represent a very limited share of world greenhouse gas emission if we look at the past 50 or even 100 years, yet they pay the hard price for those emissions.
How can we make it affordable? How can we create a long-term affordable financing system for developing countries?
So the SDGs, it's an investment agenda. Okay? If we look at the current number, the average investment per person in a low-income country is about $175 per person, compared with more than $11,000 per person in high-income country. This is just simply not enough to achieve the SDGs. So in my mind, there is 5 complementary strategies that are absolutely crucial in this whole debate around the global financial architecture. First is to increase the scale of financing from official sources, including bilateral official development assistance. The second is to increase the scale and the performance of national development banks that are fit for purpose for the mission of achieving the SDGs. The third, and we're reaching this point where we realize that there's a number of global commons that truly need global finance mechanisms, and by global financing mechanism, global taxation, possibly on CO2 emission, air and sea travel, financial transactions, and others. The fourth, to reform the private capital markets and the regulation. So there's a number of regulations in the pipeline so that we align our private sectors with the achievement of the SDGs and we increase the incentives to do so. But here I would also include this reform of the credit risk system, better recognition or assessment of the efforts that countries are doing to implement the sustainable development goals. And the fifth one is also to strengthen domestic resource mobilization, fight corruption, strengthen reforms governance, also digital government, digital technology and capacity building for more effective tax collection processes. Those 5 priorities in the context of this strengthening of the global financial architecture, some of the big headline priorities that hopefully see progress. There's a number of important summits coming up, starting next September with the Summit of the Future in New York. Overall, we have 2 years with opportunity with this summit in New York, but also within 2025, the conference on financing for development, and also the COP30, which will be hosted by Brazil.
I'm sure that our listeners would like to learn more about the work that you do. Maybe you can lead them to resources where they can find more about your studies and publications around this topic.
Absolutely, Pauline. Everything that in here is building on collective work at the SDSN, at the Secretariat, but also within our network. And of course, builds on the guidance of our president, Prof. Jeff Sachs. You can find our work at unsdsn.org, but also in our platform that we launched last June on the sidelines of this Summit on Financing in Paris, the SDG Transformation Center.org. So you can find all of our tools for monitoring, financing, also the SDGs.
Guillaume, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Pauline. Pleasure.